broadcasting live from the School of Athens. This is Europe and the People Without History with Mr. Olson, everyone's favorite AP World History Review service. So today we're going to depart from the College Board's expectations for the AP test and talk about a little bit of stuff that came beforehand. We're going to do ancient and classical India. So we're talking about South Asia during the ancient period, or roughly the year 8000 BCE to 600 BCE, and the classical period, roughly 600 BCE to 600 CE, when you start to see the emergence of governments, cultures, and civilizations that are both heavily influential on future civilizations, but then also reach a high apex of cultural achievement. So South Asia, ancient and classical periods. So I want to start things off with a short clip from the BBC's Story of India with Michael Wood on Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, but since the BBC has such strict copyright laws, we have to start with Crash Course. So watch this short video and we'll talk about it when it's done.
So what do we know about this civilization? Let's go to the thought bubble. Everything we know about the Indus Valley civilization comes from archaeology, because while they did use written language, we don't know how to read it, and no Rosetta Stone has thus far appeared to help us learn it. I meant the other Rosetta Stone thought bubble. Yeah. Although, come to think of it, either would be acceptable. So here's what we know. They had amazing cities. Harappa and Mohenjo-daro are the best known, with dense, multi-story homes constructed out of uniformly sized bricks along perpendicular streets. I mean, this wasn't some ancient world version of Houston. More like Chicago. This means they must have had some form of government and zoning, but we don't know what gave this government its authority. Cities were oriented to catch the wind and provide a natural form of air conditioning. And they were clean. Most homes were connected to a centralized drainage system that used gravity to carry waste and water out of the city in big sewer ditches that ran under the main avenues, a plumbing system that would have been the envy of many 18th century European cities. Also, in Mohenjo-daro, the largest public building was not a temple or a palace, but a public bath, which historians call the Great Bath. We don't know what the Great Bath was used for, but since later Indian culture placed a huge emphasis on ritual purity, which is the basis for the caste system, some historians have speculated that the bath might have been like a giant baptismal pool. Also, they traded. One of the coolest things that the Indus Valley civilization produced were seals, used as identification markers on goods and clay tablets. These seals contain the writing that we still can't decipher and a number of fantastic designs, many featuring animals and monsters. One of the most famous and frightening is of a man with what looks like water buffalo horns on his head, sitting cross-legged between a tiger and a bull. We don't know what's really going on here, but it's safe to say that this was a powerful dude because he seems to be able to control the tiger. How do these seals let us know that they traded? Well, because we found them in Mesopotamia, not the Indus Valley. Plus, archaeologists have found stuff like bronze in the Indus Valley that is not native to the region. So what did they trade? Cotton cloth. Still such a fascinating export, incidentally, that it will be the subject of the 40th and final video in this very series. But here's the most amazing thing about the Indus Valley people. They were peaceful. Despite archaeologists finding 1,500 sites, they have found very little evidence of warfare and almost no weapons.
All right, so hopefully you can go back and make a list of things that you learned from the Indus Valley from that video. If not, think about it for a second while I explain to you that the 18th century, otherwise known as the 1700s, European cities like London did not have an underground sewage system. That makes places like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, which had underground sewage systems in 1800 BCE, nearly 3,500 years earlier, quite impressive. So when we talk about civilization in the Indus Valley, it's first of all most important to know, of course, that it is settling around a river, just like all the other river valley civilizations. But then as the video told us, there are several diagnostic criteria that the Indus Valley people meet that qualify it as a civilization. For example, there are people that worked as jewelers, which means specialization of labor. Different size housing means social hierarchy. City walls means technological innovation and protection from outside invaders. The fact that it was discovered in 1920, though, indicates to us that it was in an area that is tucked away now, which might have experienced some sort of geological or environmental catastrophe. The fact that very few residents were farmers tells us that they were really, really good at growing food and able to sustain a large population. So where did these people come from? Well, most of them migrated to India from what we would call the Eurasian steppe. So these migrators, or these people that came from what is now mostly the Caucasus and Anatolia in southeastern Europe, were called Aryans, not to be confused with Hitler's Aryans, different type of Aryans. Anyways, so the Aryans came from the Eurasian steppe, and they migrated south and east through the Caucasus or through the Khyber Pass into the Indus Valley, where they set up a sprawling and complex civilization. So you can see that from Africa, originally where humans came from, into Europe, they went right along moving and settled around 1800 BCE. Now, when they settled, they were organized into clans, and their economy was based mostly on the barter system. But one thing to keep in note about India is that they have an abundant amount of products that other people want, which, as it happens, will come up time and time again in a world history class. Particularly, they have access to spices, which makes food taste better, and cotton, which you can clothe yourself with. And cotton is better than wool, which they had in Mesopotamia, because it doesn't get as hot and breathes better. All right, so the economy based on the Indus Valley was on the barter system. Now, we're also able to track the movement of these Aryan peoples because of their use of language. So the Aryan people use a language known as Sanskrit, which is a predecessor to modern-day Hindi. And we know that they're predecessors and they have a connection back to Europe or other people that migrated from the same place as these Aryans, because when you compare various words like, say, father in English, you find that as you get later, and I should say older and older languages, German, Vater, Spanish, padre, Greek, pater, Latin, pater, Sanskrit, pitar. So you can see that they originated with the same sorts of sounds and the same sorts of phonemes, or I can't remember what it is, but the basic linguistic sounds applied to their various words. Now, it wasn't only language that these Aryans brought, they also brought their own religious traditions. Their religious traditions were written down in a series of texts known as the Vedas, and this would provide the pre-religious roots of Hinduism. The Aryans had, in this pre-Hinduism, a group that would be fundamental to Hinduism known as the Brahmin. Brahmin are priests or scholars that are the ones in society that are allowed to do the writing and allowed to do the talking. So they're the ones that learned how to speak and write Sanskrit. If you speak and write Sanskrit, you can convey various messages that you want other people to hear. So they held an exalted status, and because of their exalted status and being the only ones that could reproduce history, they chose the story to tell. So usually, in old school Vedas, you see things like the one who loves all intensely begins perceiving in all living beings a part of himself. So words that try to get people to cooperate or communally exist with one another. Now, of course, this is easy for the Brahmin to say because they are on top of the society. Now, before we go on any further, I want to make important disclaimers. I am a Westerner, a Western white guy talking about India. That in itself is hard enough, but I understand how Western students, especially those of European or non-Indian descent, it's very, very difficult to study India, which is why I am so happy to share it with you. This is difficult because Indians are looking for an understanding of total being in a way that Westerners usually aren't. So, for example, teaching you about India, some say, is kind of like trying to describe the sunset to one who is born blind. Now, oftentimes my students will respond by saying, I would just tell them that it's red, which then leads me to ask you, how do you tell a blind person what red is? Now, I realize there are different stages of blindness and different severities, so sort of take that generalization for what it's worth. Now, Hinduism's core question, we're getting to the emergence of Hinduism as a formal religion in this part of the world. The question that they want to answer is, how do we access the infinite creative power of life? This is not material, this is not intellectual, this is spiritual. Creative power of life, which basically means how do we reach a perpetual life in its most creative form. That is Hinduism, and it seeks to strive that infinite creative power through yoga. Now, according to one scholar of religions, Houston Smith, he says, incredible things can be done with the body if you are willing to give your life to the project. If their cultivation stems from a desire to show off, they can actually impede spiritual growth. So while in Hinduism, yoga is all about channeling infinite creative power. In the West, whose core question is, how can I be hot? Yoga takes on a different meaning. So, yoga in the West, not necessarily to channel infinite spiritual creative power, but rather, how do I become physically fit and make certain muscles on my body look good? Now, another jumping off point from Hinduism is this. Oftentimes in a history class, we categorize religions based upon whether they are polytheistic or monotheistic, which brings us to the question, is Hinduism polytheistic or monotheistic? The answer is yes. Kind of difficult to understand, especially if you are somebody who subscribes to a monotheistic religion, but try and follow me. In Hinduism, there is one creator god that assumes the role and the image of all the other gods. So is it monotheistic? Yes. Is it polytheistic? Yes. And that is a source of confusion for a lot of students. Now, I don't think that you'll ever be asked that question outright because it is a very difficult answer, but many Hindus will ask the question, why have only one God when you can have millions? A question most Americans apply to dollar bills, other people apply to gods. Okay, underlying this Hindu religious tradition are the ideas of karma, dharma, and the explanation of those are found in a variety of religious texts known as the Upanishads. The Upanishads are basically like revisions of the Vedas, so they basically catch them up to speed, kind of like the New Testament is a revision or catching up to speed of the Old Testament. Upanishads do the same thing with the Vedas. Now, the Aryans, as they came in to what is now India, if you can imagine India on a map, the people who were already living there were known as the Dravidians. And the Dravidians were from further south in India. They had darker skin as a result of evolutionary pigmentation. And when they come together, well, their worlds collide. And one way that their worlds collide is that the Vedas, which are those religious texts that the Aryans brought with them, are bestowed upon the people that already lived there and quickly adopted because of Aryan domination over the Dravidians. Now, these Vedas help establish the caste system or a system of societal organization. Now, usually, Westerners look at the caste system, particularly because of Portuguese and British vilification of these systems historically, as something that is terribly bad. Now, if you are someone who is thinking the caste system is objectively horrible, then might I remind you that likely if you're listening to this video for school, you live in a society that is organized by social hierarchies. So is it that different? No. Now, does the caste system have its problems? Yes, we'll talk about them in a second, but I don't want you to vilify and smear it objectively. Now, the caste system is perpetuated, like I said before, through three important ideas. Dharma, which is one's duty, karma, how effectively you fulfill that duty, and samsara, which is basically reincarnation based upon how well you fulfilled that duty. Now, ultimately, the goal is to free yourself from the reincarnation merry-go-round altogether in an experience of enlightenment called moksha. So I live as something, perhaps it's a baker. If I do a good job as a baker, my karma is positive. I will be reincarnated through samsara as something better than a baker, one step closer to moksha, which is freeing yourself from the reincarnation process altogether. If you need a mnemonic or heuristic to help you remember this, might I introduce you to the god Purusha. Purusha, who is known according to the Aryan Vedas as the first human being, was split up by the great creator god. And when the great creator god split Purusha up, the creator god made Purusha's feet into the workers or the Shudras, legs into the Vaisyas or the peasants and traders and merchants because, the thighs are the money makers. The arms or the gun show became the Kshatriyas or the warriors, and the mouth, those that are able to speak, became the Brahmin. Those were the ones that were able to tell the stories, learned how to read and write, therefore they could pass on the various aspects of Hindu life. Now, according to Hindus, many Hindus, this is of course not meant to be a generalizing presentation. I realize that there are different beliefs within the Hindu faith. So traditionally and historically, Hindus have believed that the world is but an illusion called Maya. Now, this illusion essentially is obstacle course for you to navigate through in order to find your true self. Now, you can only be saved if you recognize and reject this illusion. It might take many lifetimes to do it, which is why souls do not die, they are reincarnated. Should you believe that reincarnation is a thing, might I provide you this, or this, and so on. Look at this. This is absolutely insane. This one's okay. But here, Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Ryan Reynolds, reincarnations. Franklin Pierce and Nick Jonas, reincarnations. Some random historical person, Robert Patterson, yes. How about this one? Draco Malfoy and young Vladimir Putin. My favorite, of course, is this one, Stalin and Borat. Okay, you get the gist of this. Okay, so like I said before, Hinduism operates under this idea that one is born with a dharma or a moral duty that they must advance. How well they advance that is called their karma, and therefore they will be reincarnated based on that karma. If their karma is good, they've done a good job with their duty, reincarnated well. If their karma is bad, they've not done well with their duty, reincarnated into a lesser status. Eventually, the goal is to reach perfect peace. Now, this is best exemplified and perpetuated through a classic Indian story known as the Bhagavad Gita, which is an incredibly long epic in which Arjuna, who's a warrior, meets on the battlefield his friends and family on the other side. Since Arjuna is a kshatriya, he needs to fight those people. That is his duty. He doesn't want to. He puts his sword down and says, I will not do it. Lord Krishna comes down and says, Arjuna, you must fulfill your duty. If you do not, you will be reincarnated into a lesser status. Arjuna submits, says, okay, fine, battles with his friends and family, and as a result of that, he is able to be reincarnated in a positive way. Now, I realize for many of you this might seem odd and strange, but I think there is something valuable in considering this. Are we all, as humans, masked actors who go through life as if we are playing someone else? By that I mean, do we put on a show for everyone instead of paying attention to who we really are? Have we convinced ourselves that the part we have been assigned to is actually who we are? Should we remove that mask to unveil to the world what really is beneath? I find that some aspect of that inspirational. Now, the social ramification of this caste system cannot be understated. It did set up a social hierarchy. It did create social organization and social obligations, and that is where the caste system comes from. Now, originally, when the Aryans first came into contact with the Dravidians, who had darker skin complexion, they used Varna or skin color to differentiate. However, over time, because the Dravidians and the Aryans intermingled, the Varna became less and less of a distinguishing factor. Today, in India, you will find that there is a fifth part of the caste system known as the Dalits or the Untouchables. This is a group that was added on later, which goes to show us two things. One, that there is a group of people in India that are incredibly oppressed and held down by social conventions, but that also the caste system is incredibly durable. It can be changed over time, the meaning of it, its application, and whatnot. Oftentimes it's very rigid, and you cannot in this lifetime transcend the caste into which you are born. Now that is problematic for people, especially those born into a low caste. So I ask you this question: why might some not like Hinduism? If you can't answer that right away, go ahead and pause me and go back and review and reflect. If you can, let's move on to religious responses to Hinduism's strict nature. The first one comes about through in a religion known as Jainism. Now, Jainism is actually a religion of some people that go to our high school and live in the Chicagoland area, so it's one that you might have been exposed to. Jains usually are non-violent. They are people that read and uphold the Upanishads, but their non-violent character has both led to some calamity for them, but also some stereotypes. So, for example, historically, Jains have been opposed to farming since sowing the seeds into the soil and plowing it might lead to the death of some or some organisms in the soil. They've been against farming. That's not a thing anymore because some did starve. However, modern day Jains might, if depending on how committed they are, perhaps they wear a mask in public because they don't want any sort of living being to fly into their mouth. And so on and so on. So that is something that, of course, can be vilified and scorned by people that don't live in that area or don't follow that religion. But I encourage everyone, we need to transcend our Orientalism as much as possible. The other and more historically profound emergence was that of Buddhism. So Buddhism is started by a man named Siddhartha Gautama, who eventually will become known as the Buddha, who puts forth an understanding of the world that is wrapped into four noble truths, arguing in the last one that there is an eightfold path that you can follow in order to achieve nirvana, or the Hindu or the Buddhist thought that's similar to Hindu samsara. Okay, so the freeing of yourself from the reincarnation process. However, in Buddhism, they believe that that can be achieved in this life, as opposed to Hindus who think that it's not. Now, for a little bit of historical background, here is a short introduction to the Siddhartha guy.
Let's go to the thought bubble. So there was this prince, Siddhartha Gautama, whose father kept him locked away in a palace because a prophecy foretold that the family would lose the kingdom if he ever left. But as house arrests go, this was a good one. Siddhartha had great food, great entertainment, a hot cousin for a wife, etc., but he suspected that there was more to life. So he snuck out of the palace a few times. On these travels, he encountered an old man, a sick man, and finally, a corpse. Having realized the ubiquity of suffering, Siddhartha left the palace, renounced the crown, and sought out the holiest men to try to find how it could be possible that life would come to such a terrible end. Eventually, Gautama became an ascetic, fasting and meditating for days at a time, hoping to find enlightenment. And finally, after meditating for about a month under a tree, it came to him. Nirvana. No, not that one. Yes, that. He finally understood the meaning of life and began teaching it to people who would become his disciples. He had become the Buddha, which means teacher, and he taught the Four Noble Truths, which are: 1, all life is suffering. 2, the source of suffering is desire. Not just sexual desire, but all wanting of stuff and prestige. 3, to stop suffering, you must rid yourself of desire. This sounds simple enough, but if you've ever been dumped by someone, you know that it is not that easy to just stop desiring. 4, so how do you do it? By following the Eightfold Path, which, as you may suspect, is a set of 8 prescriptions on how to live that we don't have time to talk about because, oh, wait, look, Thought Bubble, you put some learning in our learning so we can learn while we learn. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So as a religion, Buddhism involves a lot of meditating and moderation and...
Okay, so as he says, and he does a pretty good job of explaining this, the Four Noble Truths, as put forth by Siddhartha, who at this point, if you can't recognize what his upbringing was like or what led him to conceive of Buddhism, you should go back and check that out. So the 4 principles: all life is suffering. Suffering comes from material devotion. You renounce material devotion in order to alleviate yourself of suffering, and you can do that through the Eightfold Path, which includes you need to have proper views, seeing life as it really is, proper intentions, living a life of goodwill, striving towards perfection, living a life of good speech, avoiding lies and gossip, good actions, being abiding and honest, good living qualities, avoiding work that harms other people, positive effort, seeking to prevent evil, mindfulness, constant awareness of yourself, and concentration, directing mind in meditation. So there's some overlap between that and Hinduism, but not a ton. So partial overlap is this: in both of them, you see some version of reincarnation. However, the difference becomes mainly that in Buddhism, you can be reincarnated in this life. Karma exists in both of them. That will determine your reincarnation. But an important difference is how the religion is spread. So, for example, in Hinduism, since it's passed down from family to family and is sort of, I don't want to use the word imposed, but it's an aspect of society in which you are born in. Buddhism is a proselytizing, universalizing religion, just like Christianity, that seeks active converts often. And as a result of that, there are several monasteries that are built as sort of things that shout the word of Buddhism to the countryside and to potential new followers. Now, you might think that Buddhism is incredibly benevolent, which for the most part it is, and peaceful, for the most part it is. However, it does not necessarily lead to 100% equality. Rather, there is inequality that is tolerated by Buddhism, particularly in the form of gender roles. Monks could only be men could be educated, and therefore even the most progressive of religions had its downfalls. Okay, so now political developments include the emergence of the classical empire known as the Mauryan Empire. The Indus Valley civilizations disappeared roughly around the year 1000 BCE, and nobody really knows what happens to them because of the lack of written records. But the fact that they were peaceful indicates they probably got taken over. Fast forward to about the year 350 BCE. There is a young boy named Chandragupta Maurya who is entranced by a European man who rides into the Indus Valley on a horse with a big feather hat. You might know him as Alexander the Great. And when Chandragupta Maurya sees Alexander the Great, he says, "I want to be like that guy." And he starts to put the wheels in motion, and eventually, as he gets older, he establishes the Mauryan Empire, or the first classical empire in Indian history. Above all else, its defining characteristic is that of a centralized government. The Mauryan government is well known for first splitting a previously ununified India into 16 well-known and well-regulated provinces that help extract taxes from its citizens. So here are the provinces that help organize the area in order to extract those taxes. Now, Chandragupta started the empire. However, its poster boy, if you will, is Ashoka Maurya, Mr. Buddhism himself. Now, Ashoka is well known for being a fierce warrior who expanded the borders of his empire to include everything except for the very tip of the subcontinent. Now, Ashoka is known for, after finally conquering the kingdom of Kalinga, which is right here, and sort of bringing his empire to its biggest shape, converting to Buddhism because of the horror that he experienced at the Battle of Kalinga. And as a result of the slaughter, he converts to Buddhism and changes his ways. Now, his ways are best passed on through his rock and pillar edicts, which are a series of laws and expectations that Ashoka has carved into various stupas and pillars throughout the countryside. Now, in order to do this, you obviously need a large amount of slave labor, which he did have. However, there's less of an emphasis on slavery in Ashoka's India than there was, say, in the Roman Empire. Nevertheless, he uses forced labor to build these rocks and pillars, to build a massive road system, which will be helpful in facilitating a strong economy. All of it came from taxes. Now, Ashoka dies, and there's kind of a squabble over who's going to succeed him. It's something that usually happens when you have strong leaders amidst an expansive empire. And couple that with the fact that there are a number of invaders, mostly coming from the Eurasian steppe. Perhaps you've heard of some before, the Huns, that invade and help bring the Mauryan dynasty to its knees. Despite that, there carries on in India during the Mauryan period and after they fall a heavy trade in goods and ideas. So India geographically is kind of at the crossroads of two major trade routes. The Silk Road, which is traveling from China to Europe, and also the Indian Ocean, which is the trading system of waterways within the Indian Ocean that borders India on three sides. Now, this leads to an incredible amount of cultural and intellectual blending, of which we'll talk about in a second. But let's discuss why the Indian Ocean offers such a wonderful opportunity for trade. So there are these winds that blow regularly at different times of the year that allow for boats to successfully sail through the Indian Ocean waters from places like Eastern Africa to India and then back again. And as a result of that, you have a bustling trade network in the Indian Ocean of very diverse players. So Southeast Asia, India, and East Africa all have a foothold in this area. Now, trading in the Indian Ocean is important, not only for now, but later on. But to cement that point home, here is a short discussion of trade in the Indian Ocean.
Marketplace isn't as famous as it should be. Let's go to the thought bubble. So if you live in China and you need some ivory to make the handle for a sword, you have to trade for it because elephants only live in India and Africa. One of the reasons that Indian Ocean trade took off is that there were a wide range of resources available and a wide range of import needs, from ivory to timber to books to grain. But the most important thing was the wind. The Indian Ocean is home to a set of very special winds called monsoons. You generally hear about monsoons in the context of rain in India, but rather than thinking of monsoons as the rain itself, think of them as the wind that brings a rainy season. The great thing about seasons is that they come regularly, and so do the monsoon winds. So if you were a sailor, you could count on the wind to bring you from Africa to India if you sailed between April and September, and one that would bring you back to Africa if you sailed between November and February. In fact, these winds were so predictable that early maritime travel guides often listed ideal times of departure down to the week and sometimes even the day. Predictable winds made trade a lot less risky. Like back in the day when the only power for ships were sails and oarsmen, your cargo might not arrive on time, or it might spoil, or you might die, all of which are bad for the health of global economic trade. But predictable winds meant lower risk, which meant cheaper trade, which meant more trade, which meant more people could have awesome sword handles. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Okay, there are a few more facets of Indian Ocean trade worth mentioning. First,
all right, so you can tell from that video that there's a wide diversity of people involved in this process, but then also a wide variety of goods. However, it was very, very efficient, which of course, if it's efficient, that means that there is going to be a plethora of riches brought to this part of the world. Now, after the Mauryan Empire falls in the 200s BCE, there emerges, after a short period of squabbling, another dynasty known as the Gupta. Now, hopefully this is easy to remember because they both start with G, but the Gupta period is known as the golden age of Indian history. This is the period in which we see a lot of scientific and mathematical achievements, including hospitals throughout the land, vaccines being implemented, the use of Arabic numerals, even the beginning of the use of the word zero. They figure out the rotation of the earth, or that the earth rotates, and therefore we see a lot of cultural achievement during this time period. Now, that can only happen if you have two things: one, relative peace, and two, relatively prosperous economic conditions, which of course they had during this period. One of the reasons that they had peace is that the Gupta bring back Hinduism as the predominant religion in India, or at least the official religion as it according to the government. However, they don't persecute Buddhists. So this makes the majority of people living in India happy, because the majority of people living there were Hindu. Even despite Ashoka being a Buddhist king, people remained devoted to Hinduism. But it also allows Buddhism to spread and thrive. And therefore, during this period, we see the spread of Buddhism through practices like proselytizing and universalizing. Buddhists, as we said before, are seeking active converts. And as a result of that, they're building shrines along trade routes, they're helping merchants. And because they're doing these things, Buddhism rapidly spreads outside of the borders of India, because anybody can be a Buddhist. Okay, so we're going to close things out by watching an animated map which shows the spread of religions. And when you watch it, I want you to take note of the spread of Hinduism and Buddhism. I might enter to talk over it, and if that's not your jam, I apologize. So there you see that Hinduism predated Judaism, is the world's oldest religion by about 1,000 years. Additionally, you see the birth of Buddhism in northeastern India, and as it grows, it spreads mostly along the Silk Road. So if we zoom out, you will see that Buddhism continues to spread into to China. All right. And that's going to bring that to a close. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining. And that is how you reach nirvana. This is your Buddha signing off.